I saw a documentary about the Victorian era a few years ago, and there was a portion of the documentary that talked about this guy named Joseph Kahn, a supposed French doctor. He opened this museum back in the 1800s that showcased specimens of the human body and had a section specially designated to bring awareness to the epidemic of syphilis that was affecting Victorian society at the time. While watching this part, I was taken aback by a death mask of a child who had died from complications caused by congenital syphilis. I sat back and thought to myself, this child looked around maybe 2 or 3 years old and had been suffering from such a serious disease. I wanted to know if there were any other cases of children in these situations back then. So today, we're going to talk about Dr. Joseph Kahn's museum and how venereal diseases affected at-risk children in Victorian England. Dr. Joseph Kahn's Anatomical and Pathological Museum was established in 1851 in London. Kahn had immigrated to England from France that same year and opened a museum of anatomy and pathology at 315 Oxford Street. The collection on display included anatomical, surgical, and embryological specimens that had been preserved in spirits, as well as models made from wax and leather. The collection was advertised as a display that would give the observer the opportunity to view and learn about the structure of the human body. The museum also included a section that showed the physical effects of venereal conditions like syphilis and gonorrhea on the body. This section also served as a warning against lifestyle choices that would risk contracting these infections and possibly causing public health issues. The museum is remembered as one of the nation's best known and most visited public anatomy museums. One of the main problems that displays showing venereal conditions faced was that they ran the risk of shocking visitors who had more modest temperaments, and one had to consider whether the display was offensive. To alleviate this somewhat, the venereal displays were situated in an area of the museum that allowed one to avoid it if you didn't want to see it. There were also concerns about women seeing the displays, as it would be considered unladylike for women to be seen looking at such things. Dr. Kahn himself felt that this was an unrealistic concern, considering that there were women who had careers as medical professionals who may have been interested in seeing the displays given their line of work. Though the museum received publicity and notoriety, it failed to yield much of a profit for Dr. Kahn, and the reputation of the museum was tarnished when it turned to selling uncertified remedies for venereal diseases to make ends meet. Eventually, Dr. Kahn's museum was prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857, which branded all public displays of anatomical specimens as potentially obscene, restricting anatomical education to medical professionals. As a result of the legislation, public displays of anatomy could only be found in small sideshows at fairs or carnivals. A study published in the Journal of Bioanthropology in 2021 detailed the extent of syphilis cases seen in London's children's hospitals during the Victorian era. Children's rights was an often ignored topic in social circles, and these sorts of issues were obviously not considered appropriate for most conversations. The study covered cases found at Great Ormond Street Hospital, Cromwell House Convalescence Home, and Evelina Hospital in London. The study observed the disease's two distinct forms: congenital syphilis, which one was born with as a result of one's mother being infected, and acquired syphilis, which one contracted from contact with someone else who had it. Congenital syphilis was the most common form among children. Children stricken with syphilis displayed symptoms that included an enlarged liver and spleen, meningitis, seizures, pneumonia, deafness, deterioration of their bones and joints, as well as skin lesions. The study found that between 1852 and 1921, 803 children were admitted to the 3 medical facilities with a diagnosis of syphilis, with 391 being boys and 412 being girls. Over 200 of those children were admitted multiple times with syphilis and other health conditions. The socioeconomic status most represented among the children with these health conditions showed characteristics of the working and lower middle classes. The ages of the children admitted ranged from 11 days old to 13 years old, and between 1918 and 1920, there was an increase in childhood admissions by over 100 per year. A spike in syphilitic admissions occurred between 1918 and 1920, with admissions exceeding 100 children in each of these years. The authors propose that this spike in children being admitted with syphilis was a byproduct of World War I, as this spike immediately followed the conclusion of this conflict and the return of troops. At this point, I didn't want to go any deeper. I'd seen enough, and my main questions had been answered. As I read about the museum and the data from the children's hospitals, I thought about how much medicine has improved since the Victorian era. I think that, as a society, we tend to take for granted just how difficult life was for people all those years ago. Sometimes we get swept into the romantic images we see in movies and read in books, and forget that these images were only part of the picture of what life was like back then. There were different classes in Victorian society, and they had different experiences at that time. I felt so much compassion for what happened to the children. I can't imagine what it might have been like to be a nurse back then, caring for children who suffered so much misfortune at a time when there wasn't adequate medical information to offer the full level of care that was needed. Reading the study in particular also made me think about how vulnerable children are and will always be in society. We can sometimes forget that children are some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, and reading the study made me reflect on that. So, have you heard of Dr. Joseph Kahn's museum? And what do you think about the cases involving children? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.